what Tucker can't say about January 6th.
Mr. Reagan.
Tucker Carlson broadcast a brilliant and infuriating report this week about the January 6th protest. The footage Tucker presented exposed January 6th as nothing like an insurrection. It was, as I have been saying ever since that day, a bunch of middle-aged Americans casually walking through a building. But as compelling and infuriating as Tucker's report was, there were a few things that he can't say, but I will. That in one moment. First, I have to sell you something. Noble Gold Investments is pleased to let you know that gold is the best investment class for 2022. Through our record-breaking inflation rate, crashing market, and crypto scams, there is one asset that has held its own: gold. According to longtermtrends.net, gold has actually outperformed the S&P 500, Dow, and Bitcoin for 2022. Had you invested in the Dow a year ago, you would be down almost 10%. If you'd invested in the S&P 500 a year ago, you'd be down more than 20%. Had you invested in Bitcoin a year ago, you would be down more than 65%. Yes, gold has outperformed them all in 2022, and silver is not far behind. While the world was hailing other assets, the real hedge, gold and silver, are the only assets that would have protected your wealth. So join thousands of others by opening a gold IRA or silver IRA with Noble Gold Investments. Get in before the end of this month and you will bag a free 1/4 ounce American Gold Eagle coin with every qualified IRA of $50,000 or more. You cannot go wrong with Noble Gold Investments and their thousands of 5-star reviews. I think after Tucker got this footage, we were all hoping that there would be some bombshell hidden within it. And after Tucker's people are done combing through all of the footage, maybe there will be a bombshell. I don't know. But what he's reported on so far confirms my own assertion that this was not an insurrection, but rather middle-aged Americans walking casually through a building. The reason I always knew this myself was because although the mainstream media carefully curated whatever video footage they had of the protest in order to create the most violent and chaotic interpretation of the day as possible, I discovered footage from a sneaky Antifa degenerate called John Sullivan. John Sullivan walked through the Capitol taking video for an hour and a half.
You were right, we did it.
Dude, I was trying to tell you. I couldn't say much.
You were right.
Throughout the protest, he acted as an agent provocateur, an agitator, shouting, "Burn it down," a call that was uniformly dismissed by the true patriots around him.
Dude, that was awesome. Good job. Shit. Fuck. Let's burn this shit down. Yo, we gotta get inside now. We gotta burn them. We gotta get this shit burned.
At one point, one of the patriots even tells him not to deface the statues.
Oh my.
Do not deface the statues.
I can respect this side. Well, people might burn this down, I'm not gonna lie. So it might be too late for that.
So I always knew that the protest was not an insurrection. I knew that the protest was peaceful, and I reported this in a few videos. And Tucker Carlson's reporting has completely validated this perspective. He's shown a lot of video that nobody has seen yet. And the truth is, everybody watching this video probably knows that the insurrection, the so-called insurrection, was nothing of the sort. We all know this, right? I think even most leftists know this, right? It's just an illusion. It's just something that they're pretending is true. But Tucker's video really exposed this, really shows exactly how mild and peaceful most of the people at that protest actually were.
They're not destroying the Capitol. They obviously revere the Capitol. They're there because they believe the election was stolen from them. They believe in the system.
But there are two things that Tucker doesn't seem to be willing to state openly, and I can understand that, right? There are some constrictions that are placed on him because he is so prominent. He does work for Fox News. They have a reputation to uphold, and also he doesn't want to ruin his own reputation. He's got to say things that he can verify. I don't think that he feels comfortable saying things that are primarily speculation or things that go to people's motivations because you can't read people's minds. I, on the other hand, I am not constricted by any such concerns because I like to speculate about people's motivations, and I trust you guys to think for yourselves, right? You're not just going to listen to my perspective and say, that guy's always right 100% of the time. You're going to listen to what I'm saying, and you're going to say, do I agree with it? Do I not agree with it? I trust my viewers to think critically. So what are the two things that Tucker doesn't seem to be willing to state openly? One, that those protesters who did engage in scuffling with police, breaking windows, trashing offices, this sort of thing, that these protesters were very likely agents provocateur, agitators. Two, that many people believe that the entire reason that the police were unprepared and that there were agitators in the crowd was because this was all a false flag. That there was an attempt by Pelosi or the FBI or some other unknown entity to escalate the protest into something far more sinister. Now, again, why Tucker wouldn't address these points, I don't know for sure, but as I said, he's got a reputation to uphold. Maybe he's waiting until he has an airtight case. I'm not sure. But these are the questions that most patriotic Americans want answered. Now, Tucker does allude to these things. At the very beginning of his report, he does mention that he assumes that the agitators are FBI.
For more than 2 years, we have wondered why some in the crowd that day who seemed to be inciting violence were never indicted for it. We assumed these were federal agents of some sort. We still assume that.
Ray Epps is obviously a plant.
We hear this absurd whining about Ray Epps, who has absolutely nothing to do with any of it. They pick this poor guy Epps out of nowhere and say, let's blame the entire thing on this guy. It's the most absurd thing I've ever seen in my life. Leave that guy alone, whoever he is.
Tucker Carlson does mention that the agitators might be FBI, but he didn't mention that those engaged in physical confrontations with the police might also have been FBI or paid agitators, agents provocateur, etc. And I don't know if this is because his people have looked into it and they've discovered that those involved in the scuffles were in fact true Trump supporters, or if he just lumps them all in with agitators. He does mention that he doesn't have access to facial recognition software, and because of that, he can't identify who's who.
To find relevant videotape, our producers were given use of Capitol computers with advanced mapping software. That made it easy to find what we were looking for. What we didn't have was access to facial recognition software, and that was significant.
And I think that what he's trying to say there, and I may be wrong about this, but it sounds like what he's trying to say there is, you know, if you had access to that kind of software and you could determine who's an FBI plant, who's an actual Trump supporter, who supports Joe Biden, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, that kind of stuff, then you could kind of figure out, well, who's actually there because they support Trump and who's actually there because they just want to agitate the crowd and make Trump supporters look bad, whether that be the agents provocateur or the people scuffling with police. You could find all of that out if you had that facial recognition software. We don't have that, so that's a very difficult task. But here's why I wonder about the protesters who did scuffle with police. You don't see a lot of exposés on these guys. I don't see a ton of CNN special reports investigating the lives of the insurrectionists. What caused this hillbilly to join a militia and become radicalized? Why did he want to overthrow the government? I mean, the leftist media truly despises Trump supporters. We're deplorables, remember? So you'd think that given the opportunity to investigate our motivations and intentions to illustrate for their leftist audience the true evil that is the patriotic Trump supporter, they would jump at the chance. And yet, we just don't see it. And I can only assume that it's because maybe some of these folks, the more violent protesters, maybe they weren't Trump supporters at all. Maybe these were plants. That would sure explain why CNN isn't investigating them and broadcasting their stories. And if we look at the footage from January 6th, if we look closely at the actual scuffling with police, it's not that violent. I mean, I use the word scuffling intentionally because I think that that is the word that best describes what went on. It wasn't fighting, it wasn't battling, it wasn't an attack, it was scuffling. When I say scuffling, what I mean specifically is that there was shoving, right? With maybe 50% force, maybe 80% force at the most. Certainly not full force. It's like, grabbing clothes, pushing and pulling, maybe jerking from side to side. Maybe an officer falls over, maybe a protester falls over. But I saw no one struck. I saw no one punched, no one kicked, no one cut or bashed with a weapon. Tucker points out the claim by Democrats and by government officials that over 100 Capitol police officers were injured by protesters. A number that, for argument's sake, he accepts in order to compare it to a much more violent protest by Antifa and BLM, resulting in far more injuries to police.
Some were assaulted, that is true, and their assaults are indefensible. So how many were assaulted? Well, Garland said over 100. The Government Accountability Office says the number is 114, and we're just going to roll with that. We don't know if it's true, but we'll take it at face value. But is January 6th the worst assault on the U.S. government since the Civil War? Antifa descended on Washington, D.C. to force the sitting president from office. But it was Trump, so that's cool. And while they were there, they set a historic Christian church on fire, St. John's in Lafayette Square. Federal Protective Services, the Secret Service, and the Park Police reported that at least 180 officers were injured during the demonstrations. More cops were injured by Kamala Harris's favorite mob, BLM, at the White House than were injured by Trump voters at the Capitol on January 6th. A lot more.
But I don't accept that 100 number at all. 100 Capitol Police officers were injured? That is just a blatant lie. Now, how do I know it's a lie? Because they lie about everything. If a senator or a congressman had been injured in the January 6th protest, it would have made a much better case for the conspirators to claim that it was, in fact, an insurrection. The case that this was a violent armed insurrection is essentially destroyed by the fact that no senators, no congressmen were harmed. That's why they keep saying so many police officers were injured and it was deadly, and they keep pretending that protesters killed police, which of course they did not. Tucker places a particular emphasis on the QAnon shaman. He points out that this guy has been sentenced to 4 years in prison for insurrecting or whatever. And this guy, just like most of the other protesters, casually walked through the Capitol. And he was even escorted by police.
The single most famous person arrested that day was a Navy veteran from Arizona called Jacob Chansley, often referred to as the QAnon shaman. Jacob Chansley became the face of January 6th. A dangerous conspiracy theorist dressed in outlandish costume who led the violent insurrection to overthrow American democracy. For these crimes, Chansley was sentenced to nearly 4 years in prison, far more time than many violent criminals now receive. To this day, there is dispute over how Chansley got into the Capitol building. But according to our review of the internal surveillance video, it is very clear what happened once he got inside. Virtually every moment of his time inside the Capitol was caught on tape. The tapes show that Capitol Police never stopped Jacob Chansley. They helped him. They acted as his tour guides. Here's video of Chansley in the Senate chamber. Capitol Police officers take him to multiple entrances and even try to open locked doors for him. We counted at least 9 officers who were within touching distance of unarmed Jacob Chansley. Not one of them even tried to slow him down. Chansley understood that Capitol Police were his allies. Video shows him giving thanks for them in a prayer on the floor of the Senate. Watch.
Thank you, Heavenly Father, for giving the inspiration needed to these police officers to allow us in this building.
Tucker makes the point that it's awfully strange that police are escorting this guy, but he doesn't present a reason. He doesn't speculate as to why the police are doing this. But I think that what he believes, certainly what I believe, and I think probably what most people believe when they see that is, well, maybe the police wanted him to get inside. Maybe they wanted video of him doing whatever it is that he was going to do. Maybe they wanted those images on the news so that the Democrats had more ammunition against Trump supporters to say, look, this was a violent insurrection. Look at this lunatic inside the Capitol. And you know what? I'm glad that Tucker focused on this guy because he is such an identifiable figure, and he's been treated incredibly unfairly. This kind of focus can paint a very clear picture of the injustice here. But there are tons of January 6th protesters who didn't wear face paint, did not wear a buffalo hat, and are far less identifiable. But they face no less of an injustice.
There were no negotiations about the charges. They refused to drop any of them. And it was wearing on my nephew's mental state something horrible. We watched him deteriorate right before our eyes. He called me on the phone sobbing, and he told me that they were looking to add a terrorism enhancement at that sentencing. It would have taken his sentence to 5 to 6 years in prison. And it was too much for my nephew to handle. And that Friday evening, February 25th of last year, he hanged himself in his garage. And our family has never been the same since. Do people understand that this is a father? And I know that there are many of you in this room that are fathers and mothers. That you would have rather let your son hang himself than be subjected to the public opinion and the scrutiny from this government from this country, a country I used to be proud of. I am not proud of this country anymore. Where is your outrage? You should be outraged that this is happening in your country. And don't sit back and be silent, because you're just as guilty as they are. Your silence is deafening.
The fact is, most of the violence that they refer to on January 6th just never happened. The only one murdered was Ashley Babbitt, a protester murdered by a Capitol Police officer, an officer who should be in prison right now, but who has never even been investigated. Now, the second point that Tucker carefully avoids mentioning is the popular false flag theory. In order to explain this properly, I should define false flag. Now, I just grabbed this straight out of Wikipedia. A false flag operation is an act committed with the intent of disguising the actual source of responsibility and pinning the blame on another party. Basically, this is a crime very similar to a frame-up, and this is what a lot of people think happened on January 6th. They think that it was a false flag. The protest that occurred on January 6th created a convenient circumstance within which a sinister party could execute a false flag. But why? It seems like a pretty extreme action just to make Trump supporters look bad. The sinister party would have to organize a lot of people, ensure secrecy with all of them, potentially endanger members of Congress, and possibly risk destroying the Capitol. Subsequently, they arrested many innocent protesters just to support the illusion of an insurrection. So why? Well, it wasn't just to make Trump supporters look bad, although that was certainly part of it. You see, incitement of insurrection is a very specific law, and a very specific consequence of that very specific law happens to be a disqualification for running for public office. Trump, if found guilty of this crime, would no longer be able to run for president, and that is the motive. Before January 6th, you never heard the term insurrection. Normally, people would call it a coup d'etat or a coup. Nobody used the word insurrection. The reason that they keep using the word insurrection over and over and over again is to get into people's minds this was an insurrection and Trump incited an insurrection. And that way, if Trump's ever charged with incitement of insurrection, people would understand, yes, that is what we're talking about here. They're specifically using that term because they're referencing that law. The deep state, the swamp, the uniparty, the establishment, whatever you want to call them, these folks do not want Trump running again in 2024. Had the Russian collusion lie stuck, he would have been disqualified. Had the insurrection lie stuck, he would have been disqualified. And if the hoarding of classified documents at Mar-a-Lago lie had stuck, the leftists who created that lie believed that it too would have disqualified Trump from ever running for president. The last one was not true, but they thought it was. And so you see, the swamp dwellers have been trying to manufacture some lie or another to keep Trump out of office since even before he was elected. You see, these folks are not in politics to improve the quality of life of every American. They want money and power. That's it. They're motivated purely by greed. Nancy Pelosi famously governed at the whim of corporations that would give her special stock deals that made her enormously wealthy. Joe Biden, as we all know, funneled aid from the International Monetary Fund through the Ukraine government, through Burisma, and into his son Hunter Biden's bank accounts. The business dealings between Hunter and Chinese businessmen connected to the Chinese government very clearly amounts to bribery, pure and simple. Was Joe Biden crafting foreign policy that was favorable to the Chinese government because of the deals that were being made with his son Hunter? That is unclear, but a lot of Chinese businessmen clearly seem to think so. They weren't shoveling money into Hunter's bank accounts for nothing. And there are a million other little schemes to get Democrat politicians and their friends rich, all at the expense of the American taxpayer. The entirety of the so-called infrastructure bill was just a massive grift. And most politicians are vulnerable to some kind of bribery or some kind of threat. But not Trump. Trump was going to be difficult, and the establishment folks knew it. They needed to keep their dirty money flowing through D.C., and they knew that Trump would stop this up. And that's why they needed Trump out forever. And that's why these January 6 protesters have rotted in prison. No one involved in their arrests, their detention, their trials, or their convictions truly believe that they're guilty of anything. But they all know that this charade has to continue because the goal is to get Trump. And they've not yet got Trump. And so until they do, they're using every trick that they can, including the unlawful detention of innocent Americans, detained simply to enforce an illusion that Trump incited an insurrection. It's sick. And so, although Tucker Carlson's report on this January 6th footage is phenomenal. I do wish he'd been a little more bold in his assessment. I wish he'd discussed the possibility that those directly involved in the scuffle might simply have been agitators. And I wish that he'd presented the popular theory that the protest was used by sinister actors to execute a false flag. I mean, look, maybe there was an insurrection, but it wasn't executed by Trump supporters. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. And remember, it's not that our liberal friends are ignorant. It's just they know so much that is not so. Good night.
What is fascism? Fascism is private ownership, private enterprise, but total government control and regulation. Well, isn't this the liberal philosophy? The conservative, so-called, is the one that says less government, get off my back, get out of my pocket, and let me have more control of my own destiny.